It was spring in 1968. The year had started with the Viet Cong Tet Offensive in North Vietnam. Students across France closed down all the universities. The Red Army in Italy and the Baader-Meinhof group in Germany were killing and kidnapping politicians and business people. Russia invaded Czechoslovakia. Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And I arrived hitchhiking at night in Madrid, Spain, from 2 years being in peaceful Germany. The next morning, I was shocked to find government police with rifles and submachine guns standing on the corners of the central city. I subsequently discovered that this was normal for the fascist government of General Francisco Franco. I stayed in fascist Spain for 2 years, and I came to appreciate why many people are attracted to a fascist dictatorship. The mechanisms of the government and of civil society worked. You could walk down the street at 2 a.m. and not fear being robbed or mugged. Wine and beer prices were cheap by government decree, and so was cigarettes. Now, the cheap booze and cheap tobacco, were they a mechanism for the government to kill off people before they had to pay old age pensions? The government police never bothered anyone unless they started to cause trouble. So it was so easy to go about living a normal life and a life without any strife. It was even easy for me and my friends to work illegally in Spain. Foreign businesses were helped and supported by the government as long as they trained Spanish workers to take up the skills that Spain needed. Many British retirees moved to Spain for the better weather and a much, much lower cost of living. So what was there not to like? The main reason that life seemed so normal and so peaceful on the surface is that under the surface, it was brutal for any opposition. Because a fascist government takes away rights and freedoms, particularly for those who oppose them, there will always be some who will agitate and fight for those rights and freedoms to be restored. So to stay in power, a fascist government must be brutal to any opposition. It must curtail rights and freedoms that we here take for granted. Fascism in its modern form was basically created by Benito Mussolini in Italy after the end of the First World War. Mussolini was a prominent socialist and a newspaper editor who agitated for workers to strike and rebel against the weak, basically Republican government. Civil disobedience, strikes, and personal physical attacks were their main strategies. Mussolini fell out with the socialists. So using his newspaper and like-minded compatriots, he started the Fascist Party. The Fascist Party was a nationalist party as opposed to a socialist party. Mussolini focused the fascists against the civil disobedience and strikes of the socialists that he'd been involved in organizing. That way, the socialists could be labeled as opposition to the nation, which Mussolini and the fascists could then take on board the role of savior of the nation from this opposition. He led a march of armed groups to Rome in 1922, and taking physical control of most of the government, he was able to be appointed by the king as the prime minister. Basically, a fait accompli, because the king had little choice in the face of this large armed mob. Continuing to blame the socialists for any civil strife, while themselves conducting many attacks on persons and property, and then blaming the socialists, they got a sufficient number of fascists in parliament, while then banning socialists from parliament. Then Mussolini and his followers were able to get many laws passed, which effectively gave Mussolini and his fascists one-party dictatorial rule. Crucial to Mussolini's power was building a concord with Italy's main industrialists, as well as the rich aristocracy. They too wanted a peaceful, efficient country where they could prosper in their businesses. Government crackdowns on dissent did create a peaceful civil society, and government decrees made government and society work efficiently. Even the trains began to run on time. Many people continue to look back on these times with favor and with some nostalgia. Now, Hitler, in establishing one-party dictatorial rule of the Nazi Party in Germany, followed a similar path. The Nazis created quite brutal civil disobedience with the brown shirt thugs, and then put forward the Nazis as the party who would stop the disobedience. Hitler's book Mein Kampf made the case for Nazism that Mussolini's newspaper had made for fascism. Both were very nationalistic, and both were identifying enemies of the country, which their party could save the country from. The Nazis blamed Jews and socialists for Germany's problems, and they're able to focus that blame on the Jews and the socialists to ride to some limited success in elections. Once in parliament, the Nazis followed Mussolini's strategy of physically attacking and removing leading Socialist Party members from participating in government. The Nazis subsequently increased their MPs in the next election after more attacks on civil society, and Hitler got himself appointed chancellor by the president, promising to end the civil disobedience, which he did, except against the Jews and the socialists. The Nazis used parliament to pass laws to get total control of government and establish a one-party rule. Again, the rise in Germany was supported and funded by the rich industrialists, like the coal and steel magnates Krupp and Thyssen, and the chemical companies of IG Farben. Once in power, the Nazis gave these companies political prisoners, captured Russian soldiers, and particularly Jews, as slaves to work in their factories. So you can see many parallels with Mussolini's rise to power in Hitler's rise to power. Now, Franco's rise to power was slightly different. Spain's king had allowed elections to the Cortes, their parliament, and the people kept electing socialist governments. Power was thus passed from the aristocracy to the people, and much of the military leadership was from the aristocracy, and most of the church prelates came from the aristocracy. The socialist-led parliament was secular and thus became a focus of enmity for the Catholic Church. Therefore, the old power bases in Spain were all in opposition to a freely elected parliament and only needed a rebel group from the army, that portion of the army that was based in Morocco and thus not easily ruled by the central government in Madrid, and led by General Franco, to overthrow the government. They invaded Spain from Morocco, fought against sections of the army that were still loyal to the government, and with German and Italian planes, tanks, and other military equipment, eventually, after a very brutal number of years of civil war, they took power. So, what observations can we make about the rise of fascism from analyzing the three most prominent fascist movements of the 20th century? Italy, Germany, and Spain. One, they needed dissent and civil disobedience in civil society, which they could blame for people's unhappiness, in which they could then claim to be able to solve and eliminate. In Germany and in Italy, they actively fomented much of that civil disobedience. Two, their story was very nationalistic. We are a proud nation, and we should be a great nation again. Three, they made good use of the media to foment dissent, to offer solutions, and to condemn their opponents. Once in power, they took total control of the media. At that point, news morphed into propaganda. They filmed themselves in powerful set pieces like large rallies and speeches and military parades. Four, they relied heavily on those in old and established positions of power, money, and influence. Mussolini said the definition of fascism is the marriage of the corporation and the government. Does not some of that apply to New Zealand? Fonterra writing the China Free Trade Act and keeping politicians from facing up to greenhouse gases from agriculture. Fletcher Construction being given total control and funding for the resurrection of Christchurch after the earthquake. Fulton Hogan getting almost all the road building contracts. The electricity companies who are holding us to ransom at the moment. Okay, number 5. They were ruthless and brutal in eliminating opponents, including in Parliament, and in clamping down on dissent. Number 6, they created a unitary executive, concentrating official power in the hands of a president or a chancellor or il duce, who would then rule by fiat. Number 7, the dictators Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco had themselves portrayed almost as gods. Number 8, they created an enemy so they could portray themselves as champions of the people, and by opposing that enemy that they had created. For Italian fascists, it was the socialists. For Hitler, the enemy were primarily Jews and secondarily socialists and communists. The Franco fascists labeled the Republican opposition as communist. 9, they remodeled the justice system as a tool to eliminate opposition. In the last few years, we've seen this graphically in Russia, Poland, Hungary, Turkey, as well as what Netanyahu was trying to do in Israel before the Gaza war broke out. So those 9 criteria were common across all 3 of the 20th century fascist countries that we know the most about. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of, or weren't a lot, and are not now a lot of other countries which are not labeled fascist, but still maintain a lot of that criteria. And in particular, I'm thinking of countries run by religious people like Iran, or by military people like Myanmar or Thailand or Morocco, where, well, Morocco's run by a king rather than the military, where a number of those criteria are in place now as we speak. But those 9 criteria were the most significant ones from the fascist movements in the 20th century. And so I think we can use those 9 to try to analyze countries right now in the 21st century and see if they are meeting much, if not all, of that criteria. And I've got a list of countries that I think do meet or are moving towards meeting that criteria. Venezuela under Maduro, the President Maduro. Brazil under Bolsonaro. Now, Bolsonaro was recently unelected, and so there's hope. But there's still a lot of people who support him. Peru under Fujimori. Now, this is a long shot because Fujimori has long since been banished from Peru. But his daughter, now running the party that he started, is a significant political operator in Peru. Nicaragua under Daniel Ortega. Guatemala is probably right now going that way. There's a lot of protest against government clampdowns going on in Guatemala at the moment. Argentina, if Melia, I'm not sure I pronounced his name right, but he's the front runner in the current presidential elections, and he's an avowed fascist. Virtually all the countries in the Sahel, from Egypt all the way across to Equatorial Guinea, most of whom in the last few years have been taken over by military dictatorships and are now meeting most of the criteria for fascism. Israel, particularly with their control of the media, and more particularly, they're trying to get control, the government trying to get control of the judiciary, so the whole legal system. Syria, probably Turkey, doesn't meet all the criteria, but does quite a few. Hungary is our poster child for Nazism right now. And President Orbán, having been elected properly, I can't remember if it was 10 or 12, 14 years ago, but followed a similar path to Mussolini and Hitler in getting control first of the media by restricting it, making a lot of the media, or driving a lot of the media into bankruptcy, so that his friends and associates could then buy the media. So people associated with Orbán control all the media in Hungary at the moment. And then he went on to try to eliminate, and successfully eliminate, the judicial system. So he and his party make the decisions on what is legal and what is not legal. So there's direct parallels with Hitler and Mussolini. Slovakia recently, just in the last couple of weeks, elected an avowed fascist who had been kicked out of office when he was the prime minister a few years ago for unethical and corrupt practices, and yet was still able to get the majority of the votes in an election which is generally seen to have been free and fair. And this reminds me of the comment I made earlier about how much nostalgia there is for the period of fascist rule back in the 20s, 30s, and the 40s, and with Franco into the 50s and the 70s, because there were so many elements of a fascist society which were very livable, very desirable as an environment to live in. And I think that that's probably some of what happened with the election in Slovakia. Italy recently elected a fascist Giorgio Meloni from the fascist party as prime minister. And she hasn't yet been able to turn the country back to fascism. But in a few minutes, I'm going to show that what she's doing is basically following the script, the criteria. India, under Modi, and he's disenfranchising the Muslims and the Sikhs, which then creates enemies for his Hindu nationalist government. So most of the criteria are now applying to India. Many military dictatorships, as I mentioned before, include these criteria: Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, possibly the Chinese control of Hong Kong, and most of the stands of Central Asia: Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. Most of them have one-party dictatorial rules that follow most of the criteria of control of the media, control of the judiciary, and getting brutal and aggressive against dissent and opposition. Belarus. China meets a lot of this criteria. And Russia, probably the premier fascist state of the 21st century, meets all the criteria at the moment. The USA, under Trump, moved a bit towards a lot of the fascist criteria. But now that he's out of office, and he's got that group of very rebellious Congress people, they are, in their rhetoric, trying to create the environment for a fascist state. And some of them at the moment are trying to destroy Congress. And Trump is leading that by the things that he's saying and supporting them. And also the subjugation of electoral rolls, which the Republicans have been doing since 1994. And that's another fascist approach to get control of the voting mechanisms. Now, there's some countries with far-right fascist leanings in their major parties, either as a part of a government or part of a coalition government, or an opposition. And we see that now in France, in Germany, in Sweden, Serbia, Tunisia, and Austria, plus countries that I don't know about, so can't talk about. In the case of most of the European fascist-leaning, right-leaning parties, they're focusing on migrants. And so those are the enemy of society, which, if you get the fascists elected are going to solve the problem. The irony, of course, is they can't possibly solve the problem. But that doesn't matter, because in the media, they are claiming that they will solve the problem. They're claiming first the enemy, and then they will solve the problem. And that is going down well with a lot of other, what you might call reasonably insane people. So I would argue that there is much in the world, many countries in the world, that are going towards fascism or are already with fascist governments. And one great example, I think, and I only found this morning in a commentary on Giorgio Meloni as Prime Minister of Italy. And I'm going to read the commentary because there's a lot in it that I didn't know. Meloni's administration has spent its first months in office accusing minorities of undermining God, the nation, and family, which has had real consequences for migrants, non-governmental organizations, and same-sex parents. Enemies of the country identified. And the fascist government, or the fascists in government, because it's not a fascist government yet, are promising to solve the problem of these enemies. Meloni has also made efforts to weaken anti-torture legislation and has filled the public broadcaster media with loyalists. Now, the biggest media in Italy is public, owned by the government. The second biggest was owned by Berlusconi, who was the ex-prime minister before he died. Interesting about the anti-torture legislation, because what we know from Franco, Mussolini, and Hitler is that torture was one of the ways that they put down dissent. Meloni has attempted to rewrite Italy's post-war constitution to increase her executive power, exactly what Mussolini and Hitler did in their very, very early days in their parliaments. She has moderated the way she speaks since becoming prime minister, but she still, in private settings, holds these quite extreme views. She televises addresses to the public rather than taking questions from journalists, which was exactly what Mussolini and Hitler did too. The gay community, particularly parents who are gay, have been one of Meloni's main targets. Party leaders have even called surrogate parenting, which I think is a term used for gay people who adopt. I think that's what the term surrogate parenting means in this context. And they're saying that surrogate parenting is a crime worse than pedophilia. So that's what the government spokespeople are saying in Italy. And it's such a parallel between attacking Jews that the way Hitler did. And Jews would not be a popular target in Italy right now, but they are creating a target in their rhetoric against gay people. Meloni pretends that she's against such extremism, yet the government recently extended a ban on surrogacy to criminalize adoptions in other countries of adoptions by same-sex parents. And they've ordered municipalities to stop registering same-sex parents altogether, which of course leaves the children in a legal limbo. So I wanted to read that because it was better expressed than I could, because it's a vibrant and immediate example of a country moving to fascism, towards fascism, right now as we sit in this room. It's not to say they'll be successful. They might screw up, and an election might overturn them, and Italy might get back on track. But we saw how Hitler and Mussolini were able to slowly get the control they needed. And a lot of it was done through the legal parliamentary system. And a lot of it was done because people voted for them. So, yes, the world is moving towards fascism at the moment. Will enough of us realize it before it's too late? And if we realize it, is there anything we can do about it? Many Germans and Italians post-war said they didn't realize what was happening until it was too late.